Good evening. Welcome to yet another evening of conversations at this wonderful and grand setting at the Victoria Memorial. I have the privilege of introducing two of our guests for this evening. I have a habit of reading the last line of a book or the last paragraph as a sign of whether the book will be worth reading. And I'm sure that comes from poetry, where the last line is so important. Quote, "Who knows but that on other frequencies I speak for you." You read that, and then you read Invisible Man. You read the last paragraph of The Goldfinch, and you put the book down. Edwin Frank, poet, essayist, writer, founding editor of the New York Review, or NYRB Classics, as we know them now. Edwin Frank was born in Boulder, Colorado in 1960. He graduated from Harvard College, received a Stegner Fellowship from Stanford, and studied art history at Columbia University. He has published poems and essays in many journals and is the author of 3 books of poetry: The Further Adventures of Pinocchio, 2004, Stack, 2006, and Snake Train, 2015, and is working on a novel. The point of the NYRB series, says Frank, should be to get the books out there, spread the news, and to pay its way. It does pay its way. You could say the series started at a difficult but also opportune moment in a still ongoing crisis in publishing, a difficult business, because this last decade has been a time when more than ever, books are getting pushed aside by other kinds of entertainment and sources of information. And that has been a challenge for publishers and contributed to the decline of the independent bookstore that went on for so long and seemed inevitable. But in fact, it's changed. The decline has not only stopped, but been reversed. And I imagine that's because with books and literature under siege, people who really care about books and literature care about them all the more. For the kind of collection the NYRB Classic series boasts, they might as well have a secret direct link to Dreams Library. From a compilation of lectures on Proust by a Polish artist, writer, and soldier in a Soviet camp, from memory as a prisoner of war, never been translated, to the phantasmagorical fictions of a Ukrainian writer whose works were only allowed light of day nearly 4 decades after his death. The list is delightfully long. This evening, we bring to you the man behind the project, Edwin Frank. Edwin will be in conversation with our dear friend, Joe Schreiber. I am, for lack of a better term, a differently gendered man. No, maybe there are better terms, more common terms, transgender or queer perhaps. I use these too, at least when it's expedient to do so, or when I choose to take my place under a larger umbrella. But by their very inclusiveness, these terms are rendered senseless. Defining the self for oneself requires an explicit ownership of the language employed. The words I embrace are mutable, evolving, even in the act of committing them to paper or speaking them aloud. Labels can only take us so far. History is subjective. We can only know what we think we know, and that isn't very much at all. Joseph is a writer, editor, and lonely wanderer based in Calgary, Canada. He maintains the literary blog called Rough Ghosts and is criticism stroke non-fiction editor at 3am magazine. Let us welcome Edwin and Joe. I'll request Jan Tudar to welcome people.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's conversations with Edwin Frank and Joe Schreiber. I don't have anything to add. Naveen has said it all. I will just say that a few years ago we tried to reimagine the Victoria Memorial Hall as an open-ended space for conversations of all kinds. And one of the institutions that we have partnered with to bring to you all kinds of interesting conversations is the Seagull Foundation for the Arts. So I'm very thankful for Naveen for his generosity in laying out before us with periodic, on a regular basis, such sumptuous repasts of delicious conversations on everything. Only a couple of weeks ago, we had a conversation with the historian, the foremost historian of, one of the foremost historians of our times, Carlo Ginzburg, in conversation with Naveen himself. Today, it's a privilege and honor to have Edwin Frank and Joe Schreiber for another in that series. We have another upcoming conversations on Friday with Paul Holdenberger and Sandeep Roy. Many conversations that we have names or titles, but this series, this trio they don't have names, because we fail to put names to conversations sometimes is akin to limiting them, putting them in a box. So this will be an open-ended conversation, but I guess primarily about books, primarily about reading and writing and publishing. So that's all that I have to say. Once again, I'm very thankful for both Edwin Frank and Joe Schreiber for coming here and making time to engage all of us in this fascinating conversation. Like all of you, I'm looking forward to you. So thank you very much for coming. Please enjoy the conversations. Before they begin, I have one small but pleasant duty to perform, which is to give each of the conversationalists a small gift bag from the Victoria Memorial Hall.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you all for coming. This morning, I had a chance to sit in on a masterclass that Edwin presented to the students at the Seagull School. And during that class, it struck me, he and I are the same age, born in 1960, and I think we grew up with similar types of reading experiences. I recall looking through the backs of the books published by publishers or series that I enjoyed, looking for titles that I was interested in. If I wanted to order something, I remember going into the store and they'd pull down this big tome, books in print, and you would flip through it hoping that the book you were looking for would be in print, and then you would guesstimate what the price might be by the time it got to Canada, and it would take 6 months, and it would be 5 times the price you guessed. And that was really how you got about trying to get the books you wanted if the books you wanted were not mainstream. And today we live in an absolutely opposite world where you can order what you want online, you can search it, there are, these secondhand dealers, you can have books from all over the world sent to you. Somewhere in between that is a project like the New York Review of Books Classics. So I think it makes sense to start with the genesis of the project. And you have said that you got into editing and publishing kind of in a sideways manner. So if you wouldn't mind, could you tell me a little bit about how that came to be? Yes.
Well, as of this fall, it will be the 20th year since we published the first set of books in the classic series. And last year, I think we crossed the marker of 500 books. But when the idea sort of percolated up out of, in the middle 1990s, it took a few years to really take shape. It seemed hardly likely that that would ever come to pass. It was a bad moment, really, for book publishing in general, both really for any kind of book publishing that you might imagine. Independent bookstores were disappearing. Of course, I'm speaking in all these cases about the United States. There's perhaps, and to some extent Europe, there's maybe some Never-Never-land where none of these bad things ever happened. But in the States, small bookstores, local bookstores were disappearing in droves and being replaced by sort of large faceless bookstores that seemed like airline terminals that had books scattered around them. And the books that were scattered around them were not books that were accidentally scattered. No, the publishers had to pay those bookstores to scatter the books around. So there was, for those bookstores, it was a good model. They were being paid to sell books that they, perhaps, if they didn't sell them, they were still being paid. But it wasn't great for publishers, especially people who wanted to publish adventurous books, books that were not designed to simply push a button in the reader's mind and give him a familiar shock, or of pleasure or not. So in a way, this project grew out of that moment of crisis in the sense that so it became obvious that there were all sorts of books that were out of print that were really seriously good books. And I had not actually worked. I was in my 30s and had not worked in publishing. I hadn't done what people who work in publishing normally do, which is go into publishing right after they get out of university. I'd written for a while. I'd lived in Paris. I'd done some quite pleasant things. I'd spent a lot of time in graduate school studying art history, and I realized I really, really didn't want to be a professor. And I, as you said, sort of got a freelance job and got the opportunity to think about this problem that all these books were out of print, that were interesting books. And I had the good luck to find myself in a place where it was possible to invent this project, get somebody to listen to the idea, and finally to back it. And then we all had the good luck that it seemed to be that people were missing those books that were out of print. When we began the thing, I was sufficiently of a naive that I didn't really realize why all those books were out of print. I didn't realize that's because they didn't sell anything. I figured if it was a good book, somebody somewhere would be buying it, and there must be at least 10 of them or 20 of them, or I probably imagined, I don't know, thousands. Surely there were thousands of people buying those good books. But of course it wasn't quite so. But very few people were buying it. But in fact, it was a distorted situation where a kind of corporate publishing industry had more and more underestimated the interests of readers and more set out to feed them a kind of meaningless pabulum and say, be completely content with this. And people were not content. People wanted something more. And so, though it's not as if any of the books that we've published have become, well, actually one book we have published has become an international bestseller. But otherwise, most of them sell modestly, but they sell, and this is the important thing, you need to sell enough books to keep publishing good books, books that people want to read. And there's a certain amount of strategy involved in that, but the day that it becomes strategy simply to sell books because you're selling books, that will be a day to give the whole project up. But so far, we seem to have had luck in getting interesting people, and we've published some, I can sit down or lie down at night and say we've published some really great books that I had never heard of before, a few months before I published them. So for me, it's been a wonderful endeavor in terms of my own discovering of literature.
New York Review of Books classics began exclusively with reprints, and then first in English, and then moved into translated work, and eventually original translations, which I think now are a major part of what you have lined up, forthcoming. But can you tell me about some of the first books or notable books in those early years?
Well, really in thinking about what I wanted to do, grew to some extent out of my love of poetry, past and present, and my sense that there was always in poetry, perhaps more intensely than any art except perhaps painting, a continual cross-pollination between the past and the present, and new and meaningful art didn't copy what had been done before, but it did respond and transform what had been done before. And as it transformed, and in this I'm just in effect following T.S. Eliot, as it transformed what had come before, it transformed the whole picture of art and the picture of what art could be. So in starting, I mean, it was, the books were out of print, great books were out of print to be reprinted. I mean, they ranged in the first set from Richard Hughes's High Wind in Jamaica, which is a strange book about pirates who take some children hostage and actually find themselves taken hostage by the children, and a wonderful memoir that we did early on of by Alexander Berkman, who was the lover of Emma Goldman, the anarchist. It's a book called Prison Memoirs of an Anarchist, and Berkman was a Russian emigre in the States who sought to assassinate Henry Frick, the American industrialist of the turn of the century, and failed, and was then sent to a prison in western Pennsylvania, and the account of the memoirs very direct, very personal, very honest about a whole range of things that go on in prison, including the sexual life of prison, which is for a book published in 1914 or 15, was quite extraordinary, about the different types of criminals you met in prison. But at a very basic level, it's a book about how Berkman, as a young revolutionary, thought he knew absolutely everything about to use the Marxist terminology, lumpen proletariat. But he got to prison and he realized that, well, actually, he didn't actually understand that the young lumpen proletariat were human beings. And in that sense, his revolutionary ambitions were sure to be defeated because of a lack of fundamental attention to the lives of the people whose lives he thought he was going to make better. It's a very moving book, and it suggests, I mean, I guess between the two, you know, the High Wind of Jamaica was a bestseller in the 1920s, and it has a minor canonical position. Berkman is almost totally forgotten, but it's an effort to try and suggest the kind of range of things and the conversations between books and between the present and the past that you know, I was hopeful we could open at the start.
How about the addition of translated work? What was the motivation there?
Well, we always had, did we do no translation? Well, no, one of the first books was a translation of Chekhov, albeit, you know, translating Chekhov is not exactly it's not a neglected field. But it was, that book kind of reframed Chekhov's work a little bit. But it was always certainly my intention to do, and we did do, well, we did the Cortázar book, Julio Cortázar. We did works in translation from the beginning, but they were existing translations which we were reissuing. A number of things came up with that. One is that translations, for somewhat mysterious reasons and somewhat self-evident reasons, date in a different way from literature. It's not entirely clear why a novel written by somebody in the 1950s, full of the jargon of the 1950s and so on, and the social mores of the 1950s, should not date. And a translation done in the 1950s with those things should date. It says something about how we think about books in translation, which is to say, or think about translation, is that, I guess, I mean, in some sense, we want translations to seem to us new, even if they're very old. I have mixed feelings about the emphasis all the time on doing new translations, but the fact is, I got into the business of doing new translations too, because some of those older translations seemed stodgy, or in fact, in the case of a wonderful short novella by Moravia that we did, Agostino, were censored or Bowdlerized in various ways. Likewise, with one of the most important authors in the series, the Soviet writer Andrei Platonov. There was a very beautiful book that had been published, a translation that had been published called The Fierce and Beautiful World. And however, it turned out that the editing of the book, not for anybody's fault, but just through the difficulties of transmission between Russia, still under communism, and the United States, the editing of the book was flawed, deeply flawed. It was, so that was a book actually we published once in the old translation and then republished, or at least the main story, in a new translation because it seemed important to get it right. It's also true that I think there is a new, and I think it's great, interest in the United States and in in the United States in work and translation, which I was saying to the class today, I think has a kind of a bit of a political root, in that a United States that after 1989, I mean, it's interesting that a number of the books that I publish that were Russian books that I published, Soviet books that I published, were available for me to publish because after 1989, many of these are dissident writers. After 1989, the United States said, oh, well, we won. We don't have to carry anything about all those books. Forget about it. So they were all available to be reprinted. But I also think to some extent under Bush and now under Trump, there's people want to look at the world from perspectives that are not American, to try and get a different sense of how things are. And so it's a reaction against U.S. parochialism and self-engagement.
You did say this morning, too, that you feel it's important that any book you pick up, whether it's a translation or not, say something to the present day. It doesn't just exist in the past, that it has some kind of relevance to our world.
Yeah, especially books, the reissues, I felt that was important. That's partly because one doesn't want to waste resources on reissuing a book which is in libraries, in private libraries, public libraries, a book which is there to be stumbled over by somebody sometime. I'd rather devote resources to a book that has never made its way into English and give it a chance to live rather. I mean, I often, or from time to time, people write me in and say, Ruskin's, 7 Lamps of Architecture, it's desperately in need of